Today we have a special guest with us you might have recognized him from the Insight Change podcast, Ezekiel Feche, Zeke as he goes. Today we're going to introduce some of the fundamentals when it comes to exercise. We're going to go over through some of the fundamental movements, knowing the laws, as we want to call it, when you exercise, when to follow them and when eventually to break them. And we're hoping to start a little bit of a series when it comes to this. We're looking to get this into something that we'll be able to build up over time. You guys can sort of go through it as a little bit of a process and learn everything you need to know. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn it over to Zeke. We're gonna do a little bit of a lecture format, and we're gonna introduce some video demonstrations as well. So stay tuned and take a look at these.
All right, so today we're gonna be going over how I break down what your body does and how you can exercise for my clients. So I use what's called the fundamental movements, and I break everything down that you do in the gym into 6 categories. There are 4 for upper body that we'll go over, and 2 for lower body. We're gonna go over some descriptions of them, examples of exercises, what muscle groups they use, and then we will actually break down a movement analysis of them on how to do them correctly. So we'll start with the upper body movements. Like I said, there's 4 of them, and for proper execution of those movements, we're going to be focusing on our shoulder blades. That'll come up later in the next video. But if our shoulder blades are moving in the correct direction, most likely everything else is going to fall into place. Whereas if we focus on our hands or elbows, anything other than the shoulder blades, a lot of times our shoulder blades will not be working properly. Right, so we want to do as little work as possible and have you guys thinking about as little as possible when you're doing the exercises, so you can actually focus a little bit more on what you're doing rather than a bunch of cues and stuff. Work with shoulder blades. So the first one is going to be a horizontal push. So when we're doing horizontal pushes, we're predominantly working our chest and triceps, okay? And an example of that is going to be like a bench press or a push-up. So we're pushing something away from us or pushing ourselves away from the ground in the horizontal plane. Next is going to be the horizontal pull, so the exact opposite of the first one, where we are pulling something towards us in a horizontal plane. We're predominantly working all of the musculature of our upper back and our biceps. And an example of that is going to be any kind of row. You've got a cable row, a bent over barbell row, a one-arm dumbbell row, anything where you're horizontally pulling towards yourself. Next is going to be a vertical push. So now we're pushing up in the vertical plane. We're going to be predominantly using our shoulders and our triceps for those movements. And an example would be a barbell overhead press, a dumbbell overhead press, machine overhead press, anything like that. And then the exact opposite of that one will be a vertical pull. So where we're pulling down towards the body in the vertical plane. For that, we're predominantly using our lats down here and our biceps. And examples of that would be a pull-up or a cable pull-down or a machine pull-down, anything like that. And then moving on to the lower body. So for the lower body, to make sure that we're executing the movements properly, and it will also help delineate the 2 different categories, is we focus on what are our hips doing. And it's basically, are our hips moving up and down vertically, or are our hips moving back and forth horizontally, right? So I classify them in quad dominant movements, right, which you're going to be predominantly using your quads and your glutes because they work synergistically. And examples of that would be a lunge or any type of squat, whether it's a goblet squat, a barbell back squat, a hack squat, anything like that. And then the other category for lower body is hamstring dominant movements. So for that, you're going to be predominantly using your hamstrings and again your glutes because they also work synergistically. And any example of that would be a hip hinge or an RDL, you might know it like that, or most types of deadlifts.
Find people maybe online or coaches that try to overcomplicate this situation. And there's a reason myself and Zeke do it in a little bit more of a simplified way. This is not going to be for your 1% athletes. It's not going to be for your Olympians necessarily. It's not going to be for somebody who wants to focus on something specific. But this is for the general people like yourself who need to improve both the way you move, the way your muscles function, etc., etc. And that's why it's considered fundamental. And Zeke is going to tell you a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, so the reason I break it up like this is, like Mauro said, we want to keep it simple. You guys are probably already focusing on your nutrition, your sleep, your hydration, right? We want to try and keep the gym as simple as possible and as concise as possible. So if we break it down like this in these 6 groups, number 1, we're covering everything your body can do. There's a few things that are left out, but they're rather unimportant, right? And that's what we're here to do, is to tell you what's unimportant and what isn't. So if it's not on the list, don't worry about it too much. And the other thing too is we're hitting all the muscle groups with these, right? We've got everything covered. And that's really it. It's simple, concise, and it covers everything you need to do.
Mm-hmm. And of course, always, you're trying to keep it as simple as possible, the minimum effective dose to get the most amount of result. And this is what that covers, right? You might do some things down the road, you might change it up a little bit, your goal might change, but for majority of the people, majority of the time, this is exactly what we're gonna be doing. Today, at this point, we're going to go through the laws of the fundamental movements, and Zeke will explain to you why he calls them laws. But what I do want to say is that if you're unsure about some of these concepts, we're going to be doing a high-level review of it. We will have other videos that we're going to be considering vital movements, and we'll go through some of this in terms of the feet and the breathing and that sort of thing. So don't worry if you don't understand it. We will head over to that video after. But for now, Zeke is going to go through the laws of the fundamental movements.
All right, so as you can see, I put quotation marks around it, and I mean that in the literal way, like they're laws. I call them that because they can be broken, but if you do, you better have a good reason for it, just like in the outside world. So these are things you want to follow most of the time. Number 1, and this is a very big overreaching concept for a lot of other things as well. So if you're thinking like sleep, diet, nutrition, it carries over to that. Ride the midline. So my example here is think about how the thermostat keeps your house the temperature you want it to. If you set it at 25, it doesn't stay at 25. It kicks on when it's at 24 and it heats your house until it's at 26. And then it cools to 24, kicks on, heats to 26. But it averages at 25 in the middle where you set it. Keep that in mind when you're doing some of these exercises, because some of the finer details, like I've had clients ask me, where should my head position be in the RDL? Well, really, you're good as long as you stay out of the extremes. Don't have your head down and your chin tucked, and don't have your head up aggressively as you're doing them. Anywhere in that midline is good, right? And there's going to be a lot of examples with that stuff. So if you have questions about things and maybe you're working out at home or on your own, try to ask yourself, what would the midline be? And try to stick to that most of the time, right? The next concept is for technique specifically, and that's joint stacking, right? And what that means is for the upper body movements that we talked about before, is we're going to make sure that our wrist is always stacked over our elbow. So whether we're pushing or pulling, we always want to make sure these are in line, as well as whatever's in our hand, but that kind of goes without saying. So if you want to be a little bit more complicated, it's the implement in your hand, your wrist, and your elbow stay stacked. So if I'm doing a horizontal press, I want to make sure I'm not pressing like this. I want everything stacked on top. If I'm doing a push-up, right, you go, how wide should I go? Well, you want to make sure that you're going wide enough that at the bottom, your wrist is underneath, in this case, your elbow, right? So it's going to carry over to a lot of things. And then for the lower body exercises, it's going to mean that we want our knee laterally stacked over our ankles. So that just means, imagine this is my foot and my knee. We want to make sure that they're in line. We don't want our knees going valgus or folding inwards, but we also don't want to drive our knees out so far that they're on the outside of our knee. We want everything stacked on top. This is for stability, safety, that kind of thing. Now next is a concept called a rooting. So what we're doing with rooting is we're stabilizing the foot, ankle, knee, and hip complex. So basically our entire lower leg. And we do that via our foot, right? And the really quick way of explaining that is we try to, imagine this is my foot. We're grabbing the inside of our shoes and then trying to twist our foot towards the outside. And if you do it correctly, you're gonna feel the muscles underneath your foot, the arch of your foot, start to fire when you grab, and then when you twist laterally towards the outside of your body, you should feel your glute fire, right? The outside of your butt cheek. And if you maintain that while you're doing your lower body exercises, you're going to have a lot more stability when you're doing them, and thus safety, right? And then the next concept is bracing. So this has more to do with the torso, right? So we're stabilizing our pelvis, our lumbar spine, which is, I usually use the sternum as the cutoff point. From the sternum to our hips, I call lumbar spine. And then the thoracic spine, which will be sternum up. So sternum to like throat. But we're basically stabilizing from the hip up, right? And we're gonna be doing that more with our breathing and with our midsection muscles, right? The quick way I explain this is, if you have kids, I find it's really easy to figure out. Think about your child while you're laying on the ground playing with you and standing on your stomach. The only way you can't get crushed is you gotta tighten your abs and push out against their feet, and that creates a nice rigid muscle sheath, I call it, and that's gonna help stabilize that pelvis, right? And if you don't have kids, the example I use is, imagine you've got a buddy or someone that's about to punch you in the stomach, right? The only way you're not gonna get hurt is, again, take a big breath in, brace that midsection, stick it out, so it's not a pretty look, but it's functional. And then if you get hit, it's not gonna hurt. If you suck your stomach in, it's gonna be worse, because you're bringing the outside of your body actually closer to your organs, and it's gonna be worse. So hopefully one of those two makes sense, and as he talked about, we'll go a little bit more in depth on those two. But these are the laws for the fundamental movements. Okay, so the first fundamental movement we're gonna go over from a technical standpoint is our horizontal push. So quick review, right? That's pushing anything away from you, or in this case, because we're gonna go over a push-up, pushing yourself away from the floor in the horizontal plane, predominantly working our chest and our triceps. So we're gonna go over, our example is gonna be a push-up. So remember, going over the fundamental movements, the upper body ones specifically, I said you are going to focus on your shoulder blades to correctly execute the exercise. So in this case, we want to make sure that our shoulder blades are moving back and forth in the horizontal plane. So you'll notice that the name of the exercise correlates to which way you want your shoulder blades to move. In this case, with the push-ups, your shoulder blades are going to be moving backwards on the way down and forwards on the way up. And the reason for that in the case of the push-up is that's how your chest works. It's going to stretch as your shoulder blade retracts, and then it's going, as it contracts, it's going to pull your shoulder blade forward. So getting that full range of motion, you're going to get your chest to work as much as it can in a push-up. Now, the rest here on this list are technical cues. So a lot of times you're going to have the question of where your elbows need to be relative to your body. Do I do my push-ups like this, somewhere in between? What I recommend is actually starting from the floor on the push-up so that you can get everything set up in the right spot and then push yourself up into the first rep. Because what that'll do is it'll make it really easy to figure out this first one, which is your elbows at roughly 45 degrees to your body. So I say roughly because, again, we're trying to ride the midline. So if you're a little off one side or the other, as long as you're around 45 degrees, you're good. But what that means is if this is 0 degrees relative to my body and this is 90 relative to my body. We want to be right around the middle there. So if you're laying down on the floor, right, imagine I'm laying down, I can figure out where my elbow is, right, relative to my body before I push up into that position. And it's much easier to find out rather than I put my hand somewhere and come down and hope I'm in the right spot. I can also figure out another one of those laws that we need, which is the joint stacking, which we need here, is I can make sure that my elbow's in the right position. And now that I know where my elbow's gonna be, I can put my hand in the place it needs to be, which is right under my elbow. And then as I'm doing my push-ups, from there, I'm good to go, right? I've got two really important things taken care of, right? So once you're set up on the floor, you've got your elbows in the 45-degree angle roughly, you've got your wrists stacked underneath. In order to keep our body straight as we're doing the push-ups, right? Because we want everything to be moving as one, right? From either our knees or our feet, however you're doing them, up to our hands. We want the whole body moving together. We're going to squeeze our butt and then use another law that we talked about and brace our midsection so that we're in a good position. Squeezing the butt, right? Just driving the pelvis forward, and then we're pushing those abs out and getting them tight, again, like we're gonna get hit in the stomach. That will make sure that you're nice and straight. You're not gonna either have your back rounded or be overarched while you're doing your push-ups. And once you've done that, and I will reiterate, I put it in this order for a reason, because order matters. So we've started on the ground, done the elbow, we squeezed our butt, embraced our midsection, and now we can focus on our upper body and where that needs to be. So if I extend my thoracic spine, which is from my sternum up, without bracing my midsection and squeezing my butt first, it's very easy to go in overextension. And I don't know about you guys, but that can cramp up my back when I'm doing push-ups. And it also kills your range of motion because your stomach's gonna touch before your chest. So we wanna make sure we do that squeezing and bracing first, because you'll notice if I do that and then I try to thoracically extend, so I'm driving my chest up, I can only move my thoracic spine because my lumbar spine is locked in with that bracing, right? And if that doesn't make sense to you, the cue that I use is you're trying to bring your chest up to meet the floor, right? And that usually helps a lot with people, especially when you're doing a push-up, you've got that as the floor literally there as a cue. So, and then that will help you on the way down. And then once you're on the floor, right? A good cue is to think about pushing the floor physically away from you, because that will help you fully extend those shoulder blades all the way forward, right? And that's it. All right, so now we're gonna be demoing the push-up. So remember, this is our horizontal press. We're pushing ourselves away from the ground, focusing on our chest and our triceps. So whether you need to do this from your knees or your feet, it does not matter. You'll make that decision before you start. All the cues are going to be the same, right? So I'm gonna show you first from the knees, right? And then I'll go through the rest of it from the feet. So if you're on your knees, the only difference is from this kneeling position, you're just gonna lean forward from here and then bring yourself down. Right? If you're starting from your feet will be extended, but we're gonna start from flat on the ground. And this is where we're first gonna find that elbow position. So remember I said, if this is 90 and this is 0, we want right in between. So once we figure out that 45-degree elbow position, we're gonna place our hands in a spot that puts our elbows directly over our wrists. And then from here, either the toes are on the ground or the knees are on the ground. We're going to squeeze our butt, brace our midsection, right? And you either can look slightly up or straight. Try not to, again, avoid the extremes. No chin down, no head excessively up. And then we're gonna focus on pushing our bodies away from the floor, pushing our shoulder blades all the way forward, and then making sure as we come down, we retract those shoulder blades. Right? So that I'll do a couple off of the feet, making sure the shoulder blades move forward and backward as I'm coming down, and you'll notice everything stays stacked on top of each other. And if I do it for my feet, everything moves as one. Okay, so the next one we're gonna go over is the exact opposite of the first. So we did the horizontal push, this is the horizontal pull. So now we are pulling an implement towards us in the horizontal plane. You'll remember for this, we're using predominantly our entire upper back and a little bit of our biceps. So just like on the horizontal push, we're gonna focus on our shoulder blades to make sure that we're doing it correctly. And again, because we're moving in the horizontal plane, we want our shoulder blades to move back and forth, right? They're gonna start forward in this case, since we're pulling something to us, and then move backwards as we're pulling, and move forwards all the way as we reset back to the lengthened arm position. So for a barbell row, again, we're riding the midline, so I'm giving you some good places to start, like a shoulder width grip. If you feel more comfortable going a little closer than that or a little wider, that is fine, especially if you have some experience with it. But stay away from the extremes. We don't want your hands all the way out to the collars of the bar, and we definitely don't want your hands inside of your shoulder width, because that's gonna keep you from being able to work your shoulder blades, or move your shoulder blades properly, right? Now, once you get that shoulder width grip, right? Imagine you've got the grip, you've brought the bar out of the rack, and you're standing, right? And we now have to get into a proper hinge position, because we have to bend over far enough that we are pulling directly against gravity for it to be a true horizontal pull, right? If you're using a cable machine or you're doing a one-arm row or something like that, all of this still applies, but remember, we've got to pull directly up against away from the floor to work against gravity. So in order to do that, I cue to slightly bend your knees, keep your chest up, so we want that same thoracic extension that we had from the push-up. And then we're gonna be using two of our laws here, rooting and bracing. So grab and twist with the feet to get our lower body stabilized, and we wanna brace that midsection like we're gonna get punched again before we hinge our butt back. So remember, when we're doing a barbell row, it's no different than our lower body hinge that we'll go over in a little bit. We want to make sure we're pushing our hips backwards behind us so that our shoulders stay over our toes. And then what I have all my clients do is put the bar at their kneecaps, because a lot of people will wonder with a barbell row, how far down should I bend? Should I be at perpendicular with the floor? Or should I be at 45, somewhere in between? Again, going back to riding the midline, if you put the bar right at your kneecaps, I find that's a good position for almost everyone. And it's also something you can see. You can't see your body angle unless you're doing it with a mirror right next to you, but you can see, okay, bar's right at my kneecaps, I'm ready to go. So from that position, you want to drive the elbows backwards, the shoulders backwards, and bring the bar towards your belly button. Again, back to the midline thing. If you're a little above or below your belly button, that's fine. Just make sure you're not pulling up towards your sternum, which would be too high, or straight at your hips, which would be too low, right? And one thing a lot of people have problems with all rows, I find, is they'll end up driving those elbows back, but overemphasizing that, and then they finish in a position like this, where the front of my humerus, right, my upper arm bone, and then also the front of my shoulder blade, because it's connected, ends up forward still. So in this position, if you imagine you could see my shoulder blade, right, it should be even. It looks like this. So it's called a winged shoulder blade, right? So what you can focus on is the front point of that shoulder. Make sure it's getting pulled back as well, or you can also think about driving your elbow back and around your body, almost like you're trying to touch them together behind you. But in order to get that proper shoulder blade travel, especially the backwards portion, we need to get the front point of that shoulder backwards. So assuming you can do all of that correctly and you end up in a position like this, right, we're then returning back to the lengthened arm position. You can kind of check and make sure you didn't stand up when you did your first rep, and continue from there. And now we're gonna go over the horizontal pull, and our example was the barbell row. So when you're walking up to the bar, as you're looking down at your feet, put the bar over the middle of your foot. And then we're going to be using that shoulder width grip. So if you're not sure what it is, a good way is just to turn your palms facing away from you with your arms relaxed down. And as you bend over, that's where you want to grab the bar. Now, we want to pick it up in a good deadlift position, so I'll go over that quickly. It's not super important with this exercise because if you're doing a barbell row, it's going to be less weight than you can deadlift. So even if you do it slightly off, the chances of you hurting your lower back or anything are very, very low. But a good way to do it is once you know where that shoulder width grip is on the bar, just slightly bend your knees, right? Root and brace, since we've gone over that before, and then drive your hips back as you slightly bend your knees until you can grab the bar. Eyes up and then stand up straight. So drive your heels down into the ground and bring your hips to the bar. Now from here, we need to get into a hip hinge position so that we can do the movement. So slight bend in the knees, keeping the chest up and driving the hips back until the bar gets to the kneecaps, right? You'll be able to look down and see, make sure you're in the right position. And then from here, we want to focus on, and I'll sit this down for a second. Remember, we're driving our elbows back and around our body, squeezing our shoulder blades together. You can also think about bringing your chest up to meet the bar. But the biggest thing is we want those shoulder blades to move backwards and retract fully at the top, pulling the bar towards our belly button. So a couple reps is gonna look like this. Notice the shoulder blade movement. Hanging at the bottom, all the way forward, retracted as far back as I can get it at the top. All right, and next is going to be our vertical push. So again, we're pushing up over our head in the vertical plane, primarily using our shoulders and triceps. The example we're gonna use is a barbell overhead press. So, going back to how to make sure we're doing it properly, our shoulder blades are going to be moving up and down during the movement, okay? So the first part of the technical aspect is your grip. So in order to get this to be a little bit relative to each individual person, right, I cue people to grip just outside of shoulder width. So if you're not sure where that is, you can walk up to the bar, do this, right? Just outside of your shoulders, and walk up to it and grab it and back up and see how far away that is from the smooth or center portion of the bar. And then a good way to keep it consistent is see how far your thumb is away. Because I find most people fall somewhere between either the end of their thumb, the end of their thumbnail, or the crease of their thumb from the bar. Right? It's not a big range, but if you can find some sort of marking on your thumb, it's an easy way to keep it consistent when you're grabbing the bar. So once you've done that, you'll get under the bar and unrack it. One really important thing is do not let that bar go any lower than your collarbone, because we want to make sure that we stay in a nice chest high position. If that bar drifts any lower than our collarbone, our shoulder is going to end up rolling forward and we'll be in that really bad wung position or winged. I'm not sure which one it is. But do not let it go lower than your collarbone, and that goes for at the start and as you're doing your reps. Another really important thing, so this is going to be the first instance of breaking one of these laws. And like I said, they're laws because they can be broken. Because our head is in the way on this movement, we're not going to stack our joints. In this case, our wrist is not going to be directly over our elbow. We actually want our elbow slightly in front of the bar because, like I said, our head's in the way. If we were using dumbbells, we would be able to stack those joints properly, but because we have a barbell and our head is in the way, we need to press over top of our head. So that bar needs to go from in front of our face to over top of our head, and that's a little bit of a backward angle. So what we do is we get our forearm to mimic that angle, right? This angle is where we want to press. So when we go to press with the elbow is up position, my hand's gonna go that way. If I stack my joints in this case and I press like this, I'm gonna go out in front of my head slightly, and that's not going to be a strong position, number one, but we can also lose our balance because the bar can pull us forward. So that's gonna be the first instance of breaking one of those laws. But once you've got, right, your shoulder width grip, no lower than the collarbone, your elbows are slightly in front, that will help keep your chest up. What I have my clients do is look up at a 45-degree angle, right? That gets our head kind of out of the way as much as possible. And it also gives you something to stare at, because one big problem for overhead presses is people move their head around a lot, and it can get you off balance, especially if you have a bad habit of pushing your head too far forward at the finish. Your head will lead your body, have a bad tendency to lean forward, and you can lose your balance at the top. So staring up at 45 degrees, then before you start your press, right, we're standing on our feet, so we need to be stable. We're gonna root and brace. So again, grab and twist with the feet, and then squeeze the butt, tighten the abs like we're gonna get punched in the stomach. From here, everything should be nice and tight, and then we're pressing up and over our head, making sure that those elbows stay in that slightly forward position on the way back down so that we press in the proper position for each subsequent rep. And now we're gonna go over the overhead press. So remember, this is our vertical press. We're gonna be pushing the bar up and over our head, predominantly using our shoulders and triceps. So remember, the first thing was the grip. We want it just outside of shoulder width. So hopefully you're gonna be doing this from a squat rack with the bar already elevated. We don't have that here. I'm gonna pick it up from the floor, but luckily I've done enough shoulder press. I know exactly where my grip needs to be. But assuming you have it in a rack and you don't know what your grip needs to be, like I said, just put your hands up, eyeball that it's just outside of shoulder width, walk up to the bar in the rack and grab the bar. You can then back away and look and see how far your hands are away from the center smooth part of the bar. And like I said in the other video going over it, try to use a marker of your thumb, the end, the beginning of your thumbnail, the crease, something like that. Maybe you're grabbing right at the smooth part of the bar, but try to use some sort of landmark like that to keep your grip consistent, right? So I know what mine's gonna be. I'm about a thumb length from the smooth part of the bar. So I'm gonna take my grip first and bring it up. So remember, we do not want the bar any lower than this, because as you'll be able to see, if I drop it any lower, what happens with my shoulders? They have to round forward and my elbows get out of position. I'm not trying to press this way. I'm trying to press up and over my head. So you'll notice, because of my shoulder flexibility, the bar actually comes up under my chin. A lot of people, if you're gonna be more flexible, you'll be able to maintain that good position with the bar at your collarbone. So this is one of those little individual differences. But remember, our elbows are gonna be slightly in front of the bar because our head is in the way, and we need to press up and over our bar, up and over our head. But now we need to get our eyes up at 45 degrees. That gets my head out of the way slightly. We wanna root and brace. So grab and twist with the feet. Midsection is nice and tight, squeeze the butt. And now I'm pressing up and over my head. So notice that lockout position. I'm not in front, I'm not behind. And that's really easy to tell, because you feel like the bar is pulling you, that will tell you. And then as I'm coming down, I'm gonna fold my elbows in front of me to make sure that my elbow stays in front of the bar. And I repeat. As I'm doing this, I'm trying to keep the bar as close to my head as possible, minimizing my head movement and keeping my lower body as tight as possible. All right, and the next one is our vertical pull. So we are pulling ourselves up in the vertical plane or pulling something down to us if you're doing a pull down. The example we're gonna use is a pull up, right? An overhand pull up. Again, our shoulder blade movement is going to be up and down because it's vertical. And we're gonna be predominantly using our lats underneath our armpits and a little bit of biceps. So when you're starting out, again, going back to the midline law, We don't want an extremely wide grip or an extremely narrow grip, because that can cause issues with the shoulder blade movement. So again, just outside of shoulder width, just like for the overhead press, is going to be a good place to start. And you've obviously got a little bit of wiggle room in or out of that. One big mistake a lot of people make, and this goes back to the law of joint stacking, is people tend to over grip the bar. So if this is my bar, people will tend, I'll show from this side, they tend to try and grip like this. So when I go to hang, if I'm gripping the bar like that, that's never gonna work. As soon as I take the weight of my body, my wrist is gonna straighten out so that my elbow's following my wrist. So that can cause a couple problems. The first of all is really bad callus buildup and stuff like that, because as your wrist twists, it's gonna pinch the skin. So what you wanna do instead is grab where your hand's gonna end up anyways. So put the bar right at the start of your fingertips where those calluses build up, and then grip. And what you're gonna find is your wrist is already gonna be straight. You're not gonna get that rotation of the hand, and that's where your hand's the strongest anyways. That actually will go for the barbell row as well. Anything where you're gripping stuff and pulling it. Deadlifts, anything with a bar. That's a really good tip. So once you've gotten your grip width, you've not over gripped, you've put the bar in the right spot, then you're gonna go from the hang, right? And you're gonna start down there. So before you pull yourself up, there's a couple of things you wanna do to make sure that you execute it properly. So number one is you wanna squeeze your butt and brace your midsection, all right? That's gonna make sure that you do not overarch your lower back trying to pull yourself up. I've gotten some pretty bad back cramps doing pull-ups, because it's easy to forget about that kind of thing. Another one is to get your eyes up at a 45-degree angle, because if you've ever noticed, most people have a tendency, their bodies will sort of lean back as they're doing a pull-up. That's natural and normal, because you're trying to utilize your lats and it's a stronger position, right? As well as you will bang your head into the bar if you don't do that. So getting your eyes set up at that 45-degree angle tends to get people already in that leaned back position, so that you're not moving, nothing throws you off and stuff like that. So you've squeezed your butt, you're bracing your midsection, your eyes are up at 45 degrees. As you're pulling yourself up towards the bar, thinking about driving your elbows down towards the ground and into your body, because that's gonna get your lats to work the best. Think about thoracic extension. So this goes back to the push-up as well. Bring your chest up to meet the bar. It's not probably going to get there, because it's very difficult to do a chest to bar pull-up, and I'm actually not gonna recommend you go that far anyways, but the intention should be there. That's going to help drive our shoulder blades down properly in order to engage the lats. And then the last part is, depending on how strong you are, I only recommend you pull up to where the bar gets to between your eye and chin level, and no lower than that. Because most of the time, if you try to get past your chin, that's where you're gonna go from that nice position where you're using your lats to your shoulder blades rolling forward and your upper traps taking over. So stopping at the lowest point of your chin, right? If you're nice and strong, that tends to keep you in a good position. And then obviously you'll let yourself down from the hang or back into a hang, keep the butt squeezed and the brace and the eyes up, and into your next rep. All right, moving on to the lower body. So we're gonna start with our quad dominant movement, and we're gonna be using a goblet squat as our example. So remember, with the lower body stuff, we're gonna be focusing on what our hips are doing to make sure we're doing it properly, and also more importantly with the lower body stuff, to delineate the quad dominant from the hip dominant. So with the quad dominant movements, our hips are going to be moving up and down. So they're going to be moving horizontally, right? One really important thing that I want to start with is your foot pressure for the quad dominant movements is mid-foot. A lot of times you're going to hear push through your heels. That is very wrong when you're doing a quad dominant movement like a squat. Driving through your heels is going to try and activate your hamstrings, and this is not a hamstring dominant movement. Most of the time, the push through your heels cue is used when people are overcompensate or they're going too far on their toes. So coaches are trying to pull them back to midfoot or even foot pressure by overemphasizing going on their heels, but sometimes that can go wrong and you can go too far on the other extreme. So if you think of it like one side of the extreme is all of your pressure on your toes and the other one's on your heels, again, riding the midline. We want midfoot pressure with our squats and our lunges and everything like that. Good place to start for quad dominant movements, any kind of squats. Obviously this won't, if you're on one leg, this isn't gonna count. But a shorter width stance. So something a little bit wider versus what you'll see when we go over the hamstring dominant stuff. It tends to be a little bit of a narrower stance, and I say hip width, right? So that's a good place to start. Again, if you're a little in or out of that, that is fine. But before you initiate down into your first squat, you again want to use two of our laws. You want to root and brace, grab and twist with the feet so that the bottom of our foot's tight and that you can feel the tension on the sides of your glutes. That's really important on this one because as we get down a little further, that's going to help you determine how low can you safely squat, right? So make sure when you're doing that rooting that you can feel that tension on the outside of your glutes. You might even want to practice it before you grab your dumbbell or kettlebell or whatever you're doing the goblet squat with and actually poke the side of your glute. If it's tight and it's on, you'll feel that it's hard, right? And then bracing, again, pushing our stomach out, making our abs tight like we're going to get punched in the stomach. So now you're ready to squat. And as you're descending into your squat, I want you to think about two simple cues. These work really well with most people. Is think about opening your groins. So knees out can kind of go too far into one extreme. Remember, we want those knees stacked over our ankles, so we don't want our knees out too far. But if you think about opening up higher up from the groin in your crotch, I find that works a lot better. And at the same time, to avoid us going too far onto our toes, we want to drive our hips back like we're doing a hinge towards the wall. Because all too common, people will just bend their knees forward, and that ends up with all of your weight on your toes and not squatting as low as you can. All right, so again, we're rooted and braced with our feet in our midsection. We're thinking about opening up our groin and pushing our hips back on the way down. Now we get to the question of how low do you go? So again, going back to that rooting and feeling that tension on the outside of your glute, you want to go down as low as you can without losing that tension. Because there's going to be a depth for everyone, and it's a little different depending on each individual, but there's going to be a depth where you can't go any lower without relaxing your glutes. That's going to be your end range of motion. That may take a little bit of practicing to get used to, but that works really well for people. So once you kind of feel stuck once you get down there, because you feel stuck, you can't go any lower. So once you get to that point, when you're coming back up, push through again, mid-foot. I keep saying this, so don't push through your heel, don't push through the ball of your foot or your toes, push through the middle of your foot and squeeze your glutes at the top. Now another little caveat here. When I say squeeze your glutes at the top, I do not mean excessively tilt your pelvis forward, right? Because that's gonna round your lumbar spine and put you in a really weird position for your next rep. So you wanna maintain that brace and that root, because that's only gonna allow you to squeeze your glutes so far, right? They'll be tight, but it won't actually tuck your pelvis. And that's a proper glute squeeze at the top of any kind of squat, or also a hip hinge or deadlift, which we'll go over next. And then one last thing here is, this is another thing that gets misconstrued a lot, is torso lean. There are gonna be some individuals that can maintain the exact same torso angle on the way down and the way up during the squat, and that has a lot to do with their levers. So how long is their femur, how long is their torso, how mobile is their ankle. But that's not gonna be most people. So as long as you're maintaining your foot pressure, your midsection tightness, opening up your groin, hips back, and stopping when your glutes are tight, your torso will go where it needs to go, and you shouldn't really worry about it. But do not be actively trying to keep your chest up and your back as straight as possible, right? Vertically. That's a big mistake a lot of people make. So some torso lean is okay, and it'll be more with some people than with others. Now we're gonna go over our quad dominant movement, and that's gonna be the goblet squat. So remember, with our quad dominant movements, our hips are moving down and up, right? Versus the hinge is back and forth. And our foot pressure on this one is gonna be mid-foot. So it's gonna be even 50-50 front to back, versus with the hamstring dominant movement, the hinge, we had 60% on the heel, 40 on the toes. So you can use several different things for the goblet squat: a dumbbell, a plate. We're gonna use a kettlebell today. And I've found the most comfortable way to hold it is upside down with the handle in the middle, so you can cup it in your palm. This allows you to actually sit it on your chest. So if you get to, say, some high rep goblet squats or a pretty heavy goblet squat, what you're able to do is sit it on your chest, so you don't have to hold as much of the weight in your arms. A lot of times that becomes the problem, actually holding it like this. Your biceps and shoulders get tired. Actually try to set it on your upper chest. That helps a lot. Your stance is gonna be about shoulder width, right? So a little bit wider than on the hip hinge. And if you're a little wider or narrower than that, that's okay. And before we go into the descent, and I'll show from the side, we wanna make sure that we root with our feet, so grab and twist. Again, make sure that you feel that tension in your glute, because that's gonna help you determine how low to go. And then brace with your midsection like you're gonna get punched in the stomach. From here, we're thinking groin open and hips back. So I'm gonna do one wrong first. If I just bend my knees forward, I get stuck here. And notice my heels wanna come off the ground. I've got almost all of my weight on my toes. But if I do it right, open my groin and drive my hips back as I bend my knees down, I'm able to go much lower. So remember, at the bottom position, you want to be able to maintain that glute tension on the outside of your glute. This is the bottom position for me. You'll notice if I want to go any lower, I have to relax my glutes. I have no tension here now. And this is as low as I can go physically, because I'm sitting on my calves, but this is not a safe position to go into with external load. So you'll notice if I then re-root my feet and tense up my glutes, I pop up into that bottom position. So that's another way, if you want, you can actually start from a relaxed position at the bottom and tense up, and that'll get you more familiar with the bottom position. Now from the bottom, want to drive the midfoot into the ground, squeeze the glutes at the top, without over tucking our pelvis. And remember, some torso lean in this one is okay. You'll see I'm not able to stay completely upright. I have a little bit of forward lean. If I had a heel lift, or if my femurs were a little shorter, you'll notice if I do this, I can stay completely upright. But obviously I need to put my heels on the ground. And the last one is our hamstring dominant movement, right? So for this, we're gonna use a hip hinge. Also, once you'll see it, it could be called an RDL if you're more familiar with that, a Romanian deadlift. But again, focusing on the hips to delineate the two. With the quad dominant, we have our hips moving up and down vertically. With the hamstring dominant, our hips are gonna be moving back and forth horizontally. All right, so for our hip hinge and most of your hamstring dominant movements, the foot pressure is going to be a little bit more on the heel. So roughly 60% on the heel, 40% on the toe. You don't want to over exaggerate it to the point where your toes are lifting off the ground. You do want to keep your foot pressed into the ground and keep foot pressure. And then for our hip hinge, our hip stance is going to be about hip width. So remember, for the squats, I usually recommend something more shoulder width. So the hamstring dominant movements are going to be a little bit more narrow. We still want to root and brace, right, before we initiate the movement. And then just like on our quad dominant movement, our squat, we still want to think about opening up our groin and especially driving our hips back on the way down. The groin opening is not going to happen as much because we're not bending our knees quite as much. The hips going backwards is going to be exaggerated greatly on this one. And then just like on the squats, a lot of times you'll have the question of how far down do I go? To keep it relative to each person, once again, because we're focusing on the hamstrings, we can use the flexibility of those to tell us how far down to go. You should be feeling this done correctly behind your thigh, and you'll specifically feel the stretch closer to the back of your knee. And when you get to about an 8 out of 10 roughly, that will be the end of your range of motion. One cool thing you'll notice is a hip hinge done properly will actually stretch out your hamstrings. So if you're doing multiple sets of this, you'll probably notice that on your first and second set, let's just say you get to the bottom of your kneecap. By the fourth and fifth, you'll probably be able to go a little lower, which is again why I use this 8 out of 10 rule, because if you loosen up, you'll actually be able to get a little bit more range on the later sets, or even as you do them for months on end, they should help stretch you out. But once you're at that bottom position, so we've grabbed and twisted with our feet to root, we've tightened our abs and pushed them out like we're gonna get punched in the stomach to brace, we've driven our hips back, right? And opened up our groin, gotten down to the 8 out of 10, so this would be about the end for me. And then in order to stand up, we want to think about driving our foot down into the ground, kind of like a leg press, while simultaneously squeezing our glutes to bring our hips forward. And just like I said on the quad dominant movements, maintain that root and brace as you're squeezing your glutes so that you do not over tuck your pelvis, which again leaves us in a really weird position. We have to fix it before we can go into our next rep, because you can't hip hinge properly with your pelvis tucked. Your back will have to round. So maintain that brace, especially as you squeeze your glutes. They'll be able to flex without tilting your pelvis, and then you're back into the next rep. Keeping the bar right on the thighs, really emphasizing driving the hips back and getting to that 8 out of 10.